Welcome to Rock and Roll High School, your choice for in-depth and personal conversations with the most legendary artists in the history of contemporary music. Come with us as we explore the albums and songs that have become the soundtrack of our lives. Here's your host, Pete Ganbarg.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Rock and Roll High School. My guest this week is founding member, co-lead vocalist, and one of the principal songwriters of the band America, Gerry Beckley. Along with his two teenage classmates from London Central High School, Dewey, Bunnell, and Dan Peake, Gerry formed the band America, with the name being a nod to the three of them as Americans living in London. Incorporating three-part vocal harmony, and with all of the band members contributing to the songwriting, America signed with Warner Brothers Records in 1971. Their self-titled debut album would ultimately feature two of the band's signature songs, the number one hit, A Horse with No Name, and its successful follow-up, I Need You, and lead the band to a Best New Artist Grammy Win in 1973, besting iconic co-nominees that year like Harry Chapin, Loggins and Messina, and the Eagles. Working with legendary Beatles producer George Martin, America continued to release hit after hit in the 1970s and 80s, with even more classics like Ventura Highway, Tin Man, Lonely People, Daisy Jane, and Gerry's classic Sister Golden Hair. With over 20 studio albums, multiple compilations, and live albums, America has sold over 30 million records worldwide, and they continue to tour all over the world. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Rock and Roll High School. I am absolutely thrilled to welcome our guest today, calling in from Australia, Gerry Beckley from America. Hi, Gerry.
Hi, Pete. How are you?
I'm good, man. Good to speak with you. You and I worked together a while ago. We're going to talk about that. What always impressed me when we worked together was what a great team you and Dewey were and are, and you guys were the nicest, greatest guys to work with. And, I would ask you if you guys ever got into fights and didn't get along, but, like any 50-year relationship, I'm sure there are downs with the ups. But I was so impressed as somebody who's worked with so many different artists over the years of just the cordiality, the professionalism, and just like that's either true or you really pulled a fast one on me,
Is there any secret sauce? First of all, because we ask this a lot, how have you done this at 53 years, 54 years? And I said the secret to a great partnership is a great partner. Right. And Dewey will answer in the same way. But there are an incredible amount of things in that list that make us very fortunate that I'd like to claim responsibility for. The truth is that things just blew in our direction in many ways. And the mistake would have been to ever take any of that for granted or think that it was expected to occur that way. Dewey and I shared the success in the band. It was not on one guy's shoulders more than the other. All of these little ingredients helped. And I like to remind people, we were actually friends in high school for 3 years before the start of the band. So it's really like a 56-year kind of partnership.
Right. You mentioned 53 years of the band America. There's actually a documentary film that world premiered a month or two ago here in the States called I Need You, 53 Years of America. What was that process like watching 53 years of your lives on film?
Well, it was, first of all, they did a fantastic job. We couldn't be more proud. We're very excited. It's making the rounds of all the film festivals and stuff. And it's been winning. It won at Newport Beach for Best Audience Prize. It won the Best Music Doc recently down in Coronado. So it's getting a great reaction. One of the comments that I have heard more than once is that everybody knows the songs. There's not a person that doesn't know a good half dozen of these hits, but nobody really knew Do and I.
Right.
And this this documentary has done such a great job of filling that in great detail and how we got together and all that stuff. It's really a great film. Very, very pleased with it.
That's great. I can't wait to see it. You talk about the 50 plus year history of the band, and you've been quoted as saying one of the reasons that the band has lasted this long is, you mentioned it just a second ago, people recognize the songs. Your quote that I heard was hits help. Because so many of those songs are known by so many people and have just taken on a life or lives of their own. I was actually getting ready to talk to you and put on an old episode of The Sopranos where one of the old gangsters is driving and dies while listening to Sister Goldenhair on his AM radio. It's like these songs are inescapable.
He's reaching down for his asthma inhaler because he's just shot somebody.
Right.
That's my favorite use in any media because it was such a wonderful, as you know, Pete, this been your business. These things come out of the blue. I'd like to say that we work the catalog, but if that director wants to use that song, that's why that song is in there. But I think I would have to give the nod to the episode of Breaking Bad, that the actual whole episode is called Caballero Sin Hombre, which bookends with Walter White in his little Pontiac, kind of singing along to the Horse with No Name on the radio and gets stopped for speeding. And that's the start. And then there's a huge crap thing, a typical Breaking Bad episode. And it ends with him in the shower and he's kind of going, la, da, 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 da. It's so fantastic. I'd love to meet Vince because obviously he's a fan. He chose the whole episode is called Horse with No Name. So
did you guys ever record that in Spanish? I know you recorded Sister Goldenhair in Spanish.
I don't think we did horse in Spanish. I don't think so. Cuando pelotando narado. I could kind of remember the Spanish sister. Anyway, yeah, that used to be a thing. I don't know. You're old enough to remember. You played enough Spanish-speaking countries that, in Ecuador, they're all singing along to every song, even if they don't know the words.
In English.
In English.
Yeah, for sure. So one of the things also that always left me in awe when I was working with America back in the mid 2000s, like 2007-ish, was the amount of shows that you guys played. So I was a little surprised when I heard that you, Gerry, have retired from touring earlier this year, but Dewey and the guys are still out on the road. That must have been really hard for you going from, upwards of 100 plus shows a year. You were always on the road. And now you retired from touring. Was that a tough decision for you?
It was a decision. I don't want to say tough in that, I really struggled with it, but we did do over 100 shows a year for 53 straight years. And in my head and heart, I'd kind of targeted 50 years as a lovely number because I didn't want to just be one of these scenarios where we're 80 some years old and we're playing county fairs and things. But in the middle of 50 years, COVID hit.
Right.
So we all had to take this test that none of us asked for, but we had to take it, which is what would you do if you can't do what you do?
Right.
Now, in my case, it gave me a 15, 16 month test to see, okay, you've been talking about, winding down. How's that really going to work? And it was just a gift to me. I didn't miss it at all. What I did find is that far more of my fellow classic rock musicians were on the other side of the fence, and they were calling me saying, I didn't know what to do after 10 days and stuff. And I was thinking, well, not me. But what happened was because when COVID stopped, there was 100 shows already booked and frankly been paid for. So they had to be played. And that's how we got to 53 years. I didn't say 53 is the magic number. But Dew was on board. He said, same here, Jer. And so we called it a hiatus because we just didn't want to be on the phone talking about retirement forever.
Right.
We told the documentary crew that had been following us around that, we didn't want to spring it on them after the last show and say, by the way, that was it. But you have to tell all of the machine behind the scenes because people are constantly calling and making offers and stuff. So the word was kind of out. What happened was after 6 months, first of all, the phone never stops ringing. There's always a ton of offers to do shows, but Dew was a little bit at odds about, he was missing it. And I said, by all means, get back out there. We've got the most incredible team, a lovely guy named Andy Barr who toured with us as a guitarist and has a beautiful voice, was available to sing my parts. So there was no amount of, okay, one more time. So I was absolutely fine to answer your question. Fine with it. I'm very busy and producing myself and other acts. I'm directing a film next year. I got lots on.
Wow. It must have been odd for Dewey to look over and you're not there. I mean, one night, two night, a week or two, but, a full run and he's doing it without you.
He's been doing a fantastic job. The joke was that, I kind of ran the show. I counted every song. The songs would start without me counting them off. So there was some kind of, put it mildly, behind the scenes logistics that had to, but the song order, I mean, they did a few things. They took out a couple of my more obscure songs and put in a couple extra of Dew, but I don't know if you follow, but they've been selling out and just breaking records and stuff. And part of me is kind of, hey, wait a minute,
Do you ever regret your decision? Like, hey, next time I'm going to jump on.
I would love for this. The idea was that for everybody who gets in and looks at the details, go, well, I just saw him. He was great. I would much rather that than I saw him. It was a little rough. You should have seen him 5 years ago or something. I got up, coincidentally, a year or so ago, the Killers were in town here in Sydney. And Brandon is a friend. And he asked, would I get up and do a song? And right in the middle of a Killer show, which is a pretty spectacular concert at any time, we did Sister Golden Hair. And there was a part of me thinking, oh boy, have I made a mistake here? I don't want to ground this whole arena to a halt, with some. And the place went nuts. And the band, they were so great. They used to do it as an encore anyway and stuff. But anyway,
wow.
So I was a hero in Sydney for a few weeks. And I thought, what? Maybe that's keep that as the final memory.
How much time are you spending now in Australia versus California?
I used to go back with work. It was averaging 4 or 5 times a year. I would say that's now down to 3, but we have a lovely home in Venice. I have a studio there. Both of my boys, who I love and I'm dearly, very close with, they live in. So there's lots of reasons for me to get back. We're not going back now till the start of February, but I still maybe 4 times a year go back and forth.
And the reason that you're in Australia is because you married an Australian woman.
Yes. Yeah, I've been living down here for about 12 years.
You mentioned the Killers touring in Australia. That probably won't be the last time that friends of yours from the next generation who are in bands who listened to you while they were growing up and who were inspired by your music, Dewey's music, America's music, that's probably not the last phone call you're going to get.
Maybe not, but Sydney is, as you can imagine, an unbelievably hip cosmopolitan town. So everybody comes through here. We saw Graham Nash, who is I think 80 or something, played, and I got a shout out from Graham on stage. Wow. So I'm in the middle of the opera house, standing up to take a bow. Jimmy Webb just played this beautiful performing arts center, and I got a shout out. So I'm standing up there. Hey, I'm honored by all of these connections, but as regarding the invitations to get up, I'm not so sure how often I want to do that.
Right. Well, you'll wait till the next one comes in and you'll decide if you want to do it. Another thing that I was always impressed about working with you, Gerry, is that you, unlike a lot of your peers, are so up to speed on contemporary music and new bands. Are you still listening to as much new music as you were when we worked together?
Constantly. I used to joke about, that whenever anybody asked about, are you listening to anything new? I'd say Wilco, which has been around for 30 years or so. And I say, I'm still using Wilco as a new band. I got to get some other. So I fell into, for example, recently or last year, to deep dive into the 1975. And, I know all of that stuff, Matty Healy, and I'm a huge fan. But they've been together 20 years.
Right.
So if you want to know, let me think who would be the most current. I'm totally hooked on the Lemon Twigs. I don't know if you follow those two guys, the brothers, and they are fantastic. I love them. Cameron Crowe and I have been swapping. Cameron, I stay in touch. As you know, he's a fanatic music listener too. Yep. So I listen to them a lot. I also, living in Venice, there's a restaurant that I go to a lot, and a good friend of mine spins vinyl there. And it turned out that he had recently done a show at the Greek. And I said, what were you doing at the Greek? And he said, well, I don't know if you know, but I produced the new Andre 3000 album. And it's quite a famous record because he's done this 1.5-hour album of flute music, right?
Just nominated for Album of the Year at the Grammys.
Album of the Year, exactly. And so And he says, Gerry, he lives here in Venice and he's a fan. He would love to meet you and stuff. So the minute I go back, I'm hoping to hook up with Andre.
Wow.
Because I totally get, why is Andre doing an album and an hour and a half of it's like bass clarinet or something. And I said, the reason he is because he wants to. I love those guys that just the reason they're doing it is because that's exactly what they wanted.
Yeah, they have nothing else to prove. Similar to you, you've got nothing left to prove, only what you want to do with your life, which is such an amazing place to be in. I'd love to go back to the beginning of the story. I think most everyone who knows the story of America knows that both you and Dewey, as well as your bandmate Dan Peek, who was one of the original three members of America, were all American, but you met in England. Can you give the abridged version of how that happened?
Yeah, we were sons of U.S. Air Force, and not Army brats, Air Force brats, but there are schools dotted all over the whole world for these dependents, as we were called, of servicemen. And there was two or so in England and one outside of London called London Central, which I jokingly said was neither. It wasn't in London, it wasn't Central, but we all met there. And Dewey and I met in our junior year of 67, 68. Dan came for the last year, 68, 69. We all played in bands together. They were top 40 bands. There was a dance every Friday at the teen club on the bass. That's how it got started. And near the end of the final year, things like Vanilla Fudge, Keep Me Hanging On were setting the tone that you didn't have to copy. You didn't have to clone the top 40 songs. You could take a ballad and turn it into an up-tempo tune. You could take an up-tempo tune like the Vanilla Fudge did and make a massive ballad out of it. So I always claimed that was the start of writing original material, because it's a short leap from that to, well, I could do this myself. So all three of us did. We reconnected in 1970. We had all three been writing original material. We got together in our respective houses and we sang, and it's just one of those magic things. We had three voices, beautiful blend. Dan Peek had a lovely high harmony voice. And we were off and running. As you know, I think first album and single were virtually #1 around the world. So
you were so young when that happened.
I wrote I Need You when I was 16.
I need you like the flower needs the rain. I'll start it all again, I need you, I need you, I need you, like the winter needs the spring, I need you.
And Dewey, I think, wrote Horse when he was 17 or 18.
That's crazy to think about how young that is. And the strength of copyright on those songs. We're sitting here later, 50 years later, these songs, as we talked about earlier, are on television and film, on the radio, like everybody knows these songs. You wrote them as teenagers.
Yeah. The good news is that it wasn't just, and this is actually the case quite often. There's a big batch of tunes when you're young and influenced and keen. And my joke used to be that you poured your heart out, and that heart had lived 16 or 18 years and stuff. And then if you are fortunate enough to have a hit, the next year, you're not really worrying about a batch of songs. You're worrying about what color leather to get in the Mercedes, And so you got to stay focused, keep your eye on the prize. So I've always been quite prolific. I don't know if you remember our project together. And I think Dew turned in 3 or 4 songs and I turned in 40. And we've got enough. We've got enough of yours. Thank you.
Yeah. Plus covers from obscure bands that you were even introducing me for the first time. I was like, wow, this is amazing. I remember how excited you were to show us the band Low.
Yeah.
Who you were a big fan of back then. And I love working with musicians who have been doing it a lot longer than I have and are turning me on to new bands that I don't even know about. That was a lot of fun, too. Did you guys bond together when you met in school over a shared love of a certain type of music? Because this was the era of the harmony groups, Crosby, Stills, and Nash, and like voices harmonizing together over acoustic guitars. Was it that? Was it something else?
No, it was really that. If you consider that CSN's first album, Sweet Baby James, which was not his first album. There was the Apple album. Joni's stuff. We had, kind of homegrown in England. Cat Stevens was a singer-songwriter sitting on a stool. I like to point out that, frankly, the whole singer-songwriter with an acoustic guitar goes back way before that. It just exploded at that particular time.
Right.
And so a lot of my favorite Beatles stuff, from Hard Day's Night and stuff, is them, You Got to Hide Your Love Away. That's an acoustic, singer-songwriter song.
Right.
So it goes back earlier. But yes, that was the bomb. We loved that. 3-part harmony. I've been studying harmony since baby and stuff. So, and Dan was an incredible dude, although he didn't have the technical knowledge, had every other piece of the puzzle. He was is incredibly creative, beautiful voice, great pitch. You can't fake good pitch.
If you're writing these songs so young, you said you wrote I Need You at 16 and Dewey wrote Horse with No Name at 18 or 17, whatever it was. Do you remember playing I Need You for Dan and Dewey the first time and Dewey playing you Horse for the first time?
I do. I remember enough about it so that when I think about it, it isn't like, God, I wish I could remember what happened. But the reason I remember I Need You is that I was still living at home and my dad liked to fancy himself as an organ player. He always had a little Wurlitzer or something in the corner. And I'd been strumming it on an acoustic, but I thought I'd really like to hear how this sounds on a keyboard. So I remember playing it on his organ. So yeah, I have memories of hearing. Horse was actually in the second batch. So I don't like to get too technical, but it really wasn't the first batch. There's a show we did in 1970 or 71 with the Faces and the Who, and we were the opening act, and we were sitting on stools, did 20, 30 minutes, and Horse isn't in the show. It's like, oh, interesting. This was before Horse.
Right.
We went and played, you might know this story, we went and played for virtually every record company, but we went in and played for Warner Brothers. And at the time, Ian Ralphini was running Warner Brothers, and his sidekick was a guy named Martin Wyatt, who is still very active in the business. And we played for Martin Wyatt in his office. We played Three Roses, I Need You, Riverside. And he said that he went in the next office to Ian Ralphini and said, you'll never guess what's just walked in here.
Wow. So he heard it right away.
He heard it right away. And he said it was the hardest thing he's ever had to do in the business was not whip out a contract right away. Sign right here.
Wow.
So he heard it. We knew what we had was pretty good.
What was Ian Samwell's role along with Martin Wyatt and Ian Ralphini?
We ended up totally producing after that first album because we had a pretty good handle. I had been doing sessions in London for a couple of years. Even at 15, I was doing people's demos and stuff because I play a variety of different instruments. But I don't want to diminish Ian's contribution because he was, first of all, he's incredibly talented and musically knowledgeable, but he kept the ball rolling. And I suppose 3 kids with, in the toy chest could have gone nuts and taken weeks and weeks and weeks. And he just kept it rolling. There was not a lot of changes. They basically put the mics down. Ken Scott, who you might know, was the engineer. He had done Hunky Dory, I think, for Bowie.
David Bowie's engineer, sure.
So the whole album was done for $7,000, and it was basically, let's just record what these guys do. The reason I say that is there wasn't a lot of, I think this song, famously the George Martin story of when he first heard Please Please Me, and he said, no, guys, that should really be faster. There wasn't any constructive stuff like that, but I guarantee that the whole thing was the smooth success that it was because of his involvement.
Right, but Ian Samwell was a staff producer for Warner in the UK, so that must have had something to do with connecting you guys with Martin Wyatt, right?
Yes, well, no, we actually had a different manager this guy was managing a British duo, and shopping the tapes. And I had done some sessions for this duo, and they were playing them for Warner Brothers. And Ian Samwell heard these tapes and goes, I don't know. The guy's name was Dave House. He said, I don't know, Dave. Then all of a sudden a solo came on and he said, oh, that's pretty good. Who's playing that? And to his credit, Dave Housen said, well, to be honest, he's not in the band. That's an American kid who was playing on the sessions. He's got a band. And Ian Samwell said, well, bring me that guy's band.
Wow. How did you guys come to the name America?
We were obviously trying to come up with a name. Chicago's the original name was Chicago Transit Authority. The second album, they immediately shortened it to Chicago. I don't know if you remember The Rock Machine Turns You On, the great CBS compilation records to promote all of the acts that Clive and everybody had been signing. There was a group called the United States of America that had disappeared. And we thought, well, we could, if we can call it Chicago, we could call it America. There is an anecdote about there's a famous jukebox called the Americana, which was in the cafeteria at the base. But I think that was more, we saw that as a sign, there, it's a sign.
Right. And you probably also didn't want anyone to think that you were English guys trying to sound American, right? So let's claim it.
Very much so. We were playing all the pubs. We were playing with like Brinsley Schwartz and Jerry Rafferty and a lot of great, very talented John Martin. And we thought this is a way that we'll describe it. It'll tell a little bit about us,
And did it take off right away? Were you guys playing live in London before the album came out?
We were doing pubs and stuff. We connected with Jeff Dexter, who was the DJ at the Roundhouse, which was about the hippest venue in London. It's kind of like being at the Fillmore and stuff. And because he was handling us at the time, I just saw an ad for 1970, December of 1970. It was The Who, and it was Elton's return to London after his massive Troubadour success, where he had just blown up. And right before Elton, a quick set by the group America. So in 1970, we were playing with The Who. So it went pretty fast. We then, the album came out in 71 in the UK, and we were immediately put on Cat Stevens' whole European tour.
Wow.
So, we were playing Festival Hall with Cat Stevens and playing Vienna and Frankfurt and Munich. It was a very short, I'd like to say we paid our dues, but it was pretty quick.
You mentioned before that you were listening to, one of those original live shows that you guys did in 1970, and Horse is not part of the set. You actually recorded the full album without Horse on it. And then the record label, I don't know how many record labels would do this now, but once the album was out, they were like, what else do you got?
It's just such a strange dynamic, and I can't thank them enough, because obviously you spent your life in the business. Can you imagine waiting for your new signing? The album is delivered. How often have you heard this? Oh, we love the record, guys, but we're just not sure there's a single, That's such a common refrain.
But that's usually before it's released.
Yeah. Well, they put it out, and there was talk of maybe I Need You and maybe not. I don't know. And I remember famously that we, Derek Taylor was at Warner Brothers at this time, and that's a whole nother podcast we could do, but he was such a major influence in our lives. And Derek's office was always the go-to place. And in the corner of Derek's office one day is Harry Nilsson. So we meet Harry for the first time, and Harry says to me, on your new album, what are you guys going to do with that song, I Need You? And I said, well, at the moment, it looks like we've gone back in and we've cut these new checks. I think we're going to put out this song of Dewey's about Horse. And he says, because I'd like to cut I Need You as the follow-up to Without You. Right. So, that would have been unbelievable, Richard Perry and Harry at that time in his career.
Right.
But what happened was Horse was a huge hit, and we needed a follow-up, and
right.
I Need You was chosen, and it became a big hit for us. So.
And Harry eventually cut I Need You, but many years later, when his voice was falling apart a little bit, right?
Yeah, it's not. I just did a special down here on NPR, and there's an hour special on Harry, who we were obviously very close with. And I made sure that I included the song What Does a Woman See in a Man, which is from the posthumous album that Mark Hudson had produced with Harry. And this is a masterpiece song. I just can't stress enough. Please look it up. But it's a Jimmy Webb tune.
He laughs like a donkey and he falls into bed and flips cigarettes in the can. But she'll always act nice with no visible vice. Tell me, what does a woman see in a man?
And if you knew that the Harry and Jimmy were like brothers there. And so this is Harry. And, for all of us who thought, well, his voice was really gone, to listen to him do this song, What Does a Woman See in a Man? It's just a masterpiece. We lost Harry too soon. And I'd love to have heard him do I Need You at that stage in his career.
Right. So Horse gets cut and Horse comes out, and I think to the surprise of the label, it becomes a big hit in the UK. And then Warner Brothers US, who's not involved in the signing, since the signing is a UK signing, they're like, well, if it's a hit over there, we may as well see if it's got something going on over here and it becomes a big hit in America.
They said, if they'll agree to come over and do some clubs, we'll put it out. Hell yes, we'd love, we're all Americans. We'd love to do that. That's the dream, even amongst all the British artists who want to make it in the States. So they shipped over, I'll use some of these terms, they shipped over the parts. They shipped over to press the albums and the singles, and they pressed, I think, about 100,000 before somebody said, hey, wait a minute, the single isn't on the album.
Right, you're talking about Horse not being on the album.
Yeah, Horse wasn't on the album, and they had about 100,000 copies, which are now collector's items. It's one of those rare things where the collector's item is the one without the hit.
Right, that's really funny. So you guys came over to do the tour. Was that the tour with the Everly Brothers?
Yes, it was, yes.
What was that like?
The first show, we actually played a cafeteria in a college in Kitchener, Ontario, as a warm-up show. So that technically was our first North American show. Then we came down for a week with the Everlys at the Cellar Door, a famous place on M Street in Georgetown. And, we were such Everly's fans. And this was a big show. Pop Everly was out with them. The band was Warren Zevon on keyboards, Waddy Wachtel on guitar. I mean, it couldn't have been hipper. We did our 30 minutes and the Everlys come out and everybody'd listen to a song or two and walk out.
Ay, ay, ay.
They were all there to see these kids with this Horse song. There's nothing we could do about it, but we really felt for them. And so miraculously, the next week in Boston, where we were supposed to repeat it, they got sick and didn't show. And so the guy says, don't worry, guys, the phones are ringing off the hook. We're going to put you in the headline slot. And we said, we've only got about 35, 40 minutes. And they said, but don't worry, this kid has got a comic from the neighborhood named Jay Leno. He's going to do 30 minutes. Jay Leno in February of 1972 at Lenny's on the Turnpike. And if you ever listen or dive into Jay's career, he talks quite extensively about Lenny's, because I think at Lenny's, he opened for Miles Davis. And I mean, he was the go-to guy. By the end of that tour, a month later, we were at the Whiskey sold out for a week.
At what point do you guys leave Jeff Dexter as your manager and hire David Geffen and Elliot Roberts?
We go back to England. The album and single hadn't got to number one, but they were clearly bulleted, as they say, and it was only a matter of time. The week we got back to England, they were number one in the States. So Warner's UK had a number one album and single in the States with this, their signing, and we immediately get a call. Dewey actually got middle of the night from Leslie Morse, who was Elliot Roberts' assistant. We had been to all the Neil Young shows. Crosby, Stills, Nash had come. Joni had played Royal Festival Hall. We knew who all these people were, and we knew even who Elliot and Geffen were. And you get a call from LA saying, guys, we're sending you some tickets. You get over here. This is really where you should be. We were in our little farm cottage. So we kind of sneakily left and flew to the States and didn't tell anybody except Derek. And then, of course, we weren't returning any calls for a few days, and they were panicking. Where's our number one act? We can't get him. And Derek famously, he said, in a staff meeting, he said, everybody cool it. I know exactly where they are. Well, where? They're at David Geffen's house in the Hollywood Hills. And so that was obviously when we pushed the button.
And so you hire Elliot and David to be your managers. They're obviously famously managing Neil Young and Joni Mitchell. Was there a familial feel with the roster of the management company, or did everybody kind of keep to themselves?
I think a lot of those people were very close. Jackson, was a Geffen, not discovery, but a protege, and Jackson and Joni had been really close. They were both. Jackson, I think, was one of the first Asylum acts to be signed. Neil was a little bit standoffish. The unfortunate timing of all of this was that Neil, who we couldn't have been bigger fans, finally had his fourth solo album, which was Harvest. And the one before that, after the Gold Rush, was and still is maybe my favorite album of all time. I couldn't be a bigger fan. So Harvest comes out and he finally has a number one hit single, which for Neil wasn't really kind of part of that. So Heart of Gold is number one, and it gets knocked off after 1 week by us.
By Horse with No Name, right.
It sounded like him. So I can imagine him being a little standoffish, but he, the few times that we crossed paths, he was always very sweet. I'll never forget meeting Crosby at Geffen's house. And Crosby is a dear friend of mine, but he's, I said, Dave, we're such big fans. And he looked me in the eye and he goes, well, that's obvious.
That's awesome.
So there was stuff like that. Joni was living at the house. And so Joan was playing the piano all night. This beautiful, I'd like to say she was writing the follow-up to Blue, which was the masterpiece, but I think it was the second one after Blue that she was working on. But anyway, we got to know all of those people. It was a bit of a family. The Eagles were new, they were in the same office. Yeah, it was pretty cool.
What a time, what a place, right?
I'd like to mention that, I don't know if you got it in your list, but for the Grammy, we won a Grammy in 72 for Best New Artist.
This is an incredible story. Please tell it, because when you realize who America won Best New Artist at the Grammys on 1972, 1973, tell everybody who else was nominated in that category that year.
Well, first of all, let me say that the Best New Artist is unfortunately sometimes kind of referred to as the one-hit wonder of the year. It's very hard for somebody who's had a smash year, very hard to follow up, anybody to have a hit. But sometimes the pressure of being a hit makes it even harder. So Best New Artist nominees that year were Loggins and Messina, the Eagles, America, John Prine, and Harry Chapin.
Not bad.
Which I challenge anybody to find a stronger, every one of those went on to be a career.
Hall of Fame careers, yeah.
Yeah, just beautiful. And we were supposed to go. The ceremony that year was actually in Nashville, which is a little weird. And we had the night off, and we were all going to Nashville to watch this. And at the last minute, we were told, no, we're not going. It's off. And we thought, oh, shit. Well, we'll watch it on TV. And we watch it on TV. And it used to be, I'm not sure if it is now, but it was always the first category. Let's start with Best New Artist. And they gave the nominees. And they said, and before we announce the winners, here are nominees, Loggins and Messina. And the curtain opens and Kenny and Jimmy come out and Your Mama Don't Dance or whatever they did. They did a beautiful version of, that album, by the way, beautiful, beautiful album. And so we figure, oh, that's why we're not there. They've won it. And then they said, and the winner is America. So we were a little bit shocked, to be honest.
And you're not there to accept your own award.
And it's a lovely clip because we had to look it up for the documentary, but they said, and accepting the award for America is Dusty Springfield. And she came out, and we never met Dusty, but I think they have people waiting in the wings for the very few artists that aren't there, And she said, all I can say is I'm sure the boys are very happy.
Do you remember who told you not to go?
Well, we were with Dexter and our Warner Brothers reps. And to be honest, I think somebody probably ran the numbers and said, that's 7 flights and at least 2 nights in a hotel. Screw it. I mean, I don't think it would have been done we watched it on TV. We were in New Orleans. We had a night off. We certainly celebrated.
Man. So I want to go back to Horse for a second, just because it's your first single. It goes all the way to #1. The album goes to #1 as well for like over a month. And you're not even 20 years old. And this song was so big. A lot of people, since it was the first time hearing the band, a lot of people thought, like you said before, like you alluded to, that it was Neil Young. And ironically, the fact, as you mentioned, that Horse knocked Heart of Gold out of #1. I mean, you can't make this stuff up, right? The funny thing about Horse is it's the song that drove thousands of English teachers crazy because of the grammar. So
ain't no one for to
give you no pain.
Well, what's your point, Pete? What's your point there?
The heat was hot, as opposed to other types of heat. The song was originally titled Desert Song, but that was the same title as an operetta co-written by Oscar Hammerstein, so you couldn't use it. Whose idea was it to change the title to Horse with No Name?
Ian Samwell said, this is really great, but we're going to have to change the title. And we went, huh? And they said, well, there's an opera called The Desert Song. He said, it should be called Horse with No Name. And we all just kind of looked at him and went, oh, fine.
Wow.
We were these kids, good. And I have a few anecdotes about that. My favorite is the Randy Newman quote, which is, he said, I think I get this right. He said, that's a song about a guy who thought he took acid. That's really good. Andrew Gold, rest in peace, said, to us, because we worked with Andrew quite extensively over the years. And he said, it was always the things. He said, I was fine with the plants and birds and rocks. He says, but things at the end of that always really annoyed me.
And who's the comedian who said, you guys used to have this in your EPK? You're in the desert. It's 9 days. Give the horse a name. What else do you have to do?
Yeah. We famously used to respond that, his name is Frank and we wrote him to the bank. I don't know if you know this particular thing, but Dew's wife, Penny, and he are very nature conservatory kind of fanatics, and they rescued a Mustang quite a few years ago, and they named the horse No Name, no name. So he now actually, the guy who made all the dough on a song about a horse with a name now has to take care of a horse and, every morning clean up everything.
So 50 years later, Dewey and his wife finally have a horse with no name. There you go. A horse named No Name.
See, I've been through the desert on a horse with no name. It felt good to be out of the rain. In the desert, you can't remember your name, 'cause there ain't no one for to give you no pain. La, 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 la.
So the other thing that I always found really interesting about the way that you guys write together, that you guys write not necessarily together, but you write for the group, is you had songs that you wrote 100% that were massive #1 records. Dewey had songs that he wrote 100% that were massive hits. So did Dan. Horse with No Name, Ventura Highway, they're outside songs. Those are Dewey songs. I Need You, Sister Golden Hair are Gerry. Those are inside songs. I assume that's just how you wrote. And later on, you realized, the songs that take place outside, that's Dewey. The songs that are a little more intimate inside, that's Gerry.
That is true. And it's a lovely answer to that, because obviously your answer, how do you write a song? But I'll use another example is that we used to say, if it has 2 chords, Dewey wrote it. If it has 102 chords, Gerry wrote it. So that's another answer to that question. But I will give you an example, because you were involved in this project. We did a lovely album together called Here and Now with the late, great Adam Schlesinger and James E. Ha at the helm. One of my favorite projects of all time, Pete. And the opening track is a song I wrote called Chasing the Rainbow. And that song was intentionally, I was in the middle of months of co-writing with Dew. And what I would do is I would put together a track using what I consider to be very Dewey Bunnell, kind of major sevenths and acoustic kind of bossa nova kind of things. And then he would come over and take it and listen and see if he got a lyrical idea. And we were in a co-writing stage. He happened to skip that week. And so I thought, well, shit, I've got the whole track. So I started a sad here thing. I started writing an outdoor, chasing the rainbow, kind of outdoor lyric. And I finished the song.
I sat here thinking about my heart and all of the places it came apart. There's just one thing that I need to know. Why am I always chasing the rainbow?
But it was me trying to write a Dewey song, trying to write an outdoor song. That's how that one came about.
That's so funny. I remember, I don't even know if you know this. I was sitting in the studio one day with Adam. Adam, just the greatest guy ever, and it's such a tragedy that he's no longer here to be part of this conversation, in person with us. But he was the best. And I remember running into him one day on the street, and he said, Pete, I'm so excited about my session today. I'm like, who are you working with? He's like, I'm working with Gerry Beckley. I'm like, you're kidding. He's like, I am so excited. I can't even tell you. And I said, Adam, if this turns out to be something, I think it was like either the first or second time that you guys had worked together.
Yeah.
I said, call me. I'd like to make this record with you. And fortunately, we were able to all do it together. But I remember when we were in the studio, he sat me down. I don't even know if you were there. And we were listening to Chasing the Rainbow, which is the first song on the album that you mentioned. And he's like, Pete, this is the video. And he gives me the entire pitch of so animated, so passionate about what this video would look like for Chasing the Rainbow.
We could talk forever about Adam. I was a huge fan. We were all huge fans of Fountains. And so I had a friend of a friend introduced us, and we started sending songs back and forth. And I sent him the song Here and Now. And he said, oh, this is fantastic. And so he said, why don't you come? I've got a studio, beautiful Stratosphere studio in Chelsea. And I work with James Eha and stuff. So when I started, it was just me. But it was you talking to him saying, if this is really going on, I'd like to be involved. That all of a sudden we then better call Dew. this is good. Because I was always doing something, writing with somebody or some in solo stuff. But once you got on board, it took a serious turn into reality, and that I love that album. I don't want to sound like surprised, but I hear often how huge America fans will pick that. They say, you know, a lot of times people say Homecoming's their favorite, but my favorite is Here and Now.
I love that record too. And if our audience, if you're listening out there and you haven't heard this album, it's Gerry, it's Dewey, it's Adam, it's James Eha, but it's also Ryan Adams, it's also Jim James, it's also Ben Queller, it's also the guys from Nada Surf. And I had the best experience working with you guys on that record, and I'll listen to that record now, and I'm with your audience. I love that record. It's one of my favorite America records.
Thank you. You know, once Adam had anointed, you know, because I'm pretty sure we wouldn't have got a call back from any of those guys. But the minute that Adam, who, as you know, was so highly regarded in the current music scene, said that he's doing in America, all of a sudden people, well, hell, I'd love to. So the challenge which he met, and James too, met so well was it wasn't supposed to be a duets album. It wasn't like here's America and My Morning Jacket, here's America and Ryan. So he had to absorb and integrate these wonderful talents who were like calling every day. I mean, there was a few people we had to turn down. So it sounds like a good, strong America album, which is lovely.
Yeah, and it was done analog, right? So it feels like it was recorded. I think that was something that was really important to Adam, was to make it sound like of the time that we were all listening to these records and being so inspired what you guys did when we were growing up, you know.
James said that James's word was, he said, no, I don't want it to sound retro. He said, I want it to sound timeless. And that's the kind of genius that James was. He was much more of the Buddha who would just sit there and kind of nod, very quick little nod upward, sideways to Adam as Adam did his stuff. It's one of those things where, I don't want to say I've been misquoted, but I one time said something like, I learned as much from doing one album with Adam as I did from doing 7 straight albums with George Martin. And that's a bit misleading because it sounds like I didn't learn anything from George. I learned so much working with the master and all of those great years with George. But there had been such a gap in our recording that if you go forward 20 years to the album we did with Adam and James, just the technical aspects and a lot of the things, the tools that didn't exist when we were working with George. And I just soaked it up. I'm a sucker for all that stuff. So I really, truly did learn a ton working with Adam.
Yeah, I mean, what an amazing experience. Let's go back to making these records in the early 70s when you guys are still teenagers. Horse, big hit. I Need You, big hit. Then it's time to make the second album. You guys produce it yourself. It's called Homecoming. It has another smash hit called Ventura Highway, another quote-unquote outside song written 100% by Dewey. You know, going back to the Beatles comparison, were you guys ever tempted to say Beckley, Bunnell, like Lennon-McCartney, whether you wrote the songs together or not?
You know, I can't tell you there was a definitive meeting we had, but I do recall that the general concept that we accepted and worked towards was whoever had the song, whoever's idea it was, they'll be credited. In Dewey's case, Ventura, that'll be a Dewey Bunnell song. There wasn't a, we should make it all. It made all three of us kind of raise our game. We kind of basically said, we'll each contribute our strongest 3 songs each time. That way the album will be well-rounded. It won't lean towards one guy or the other. And then maybe we'll pick a cover or 2 that we all agree on. So that was the formula. But for example, on Ventura, the guitar lick, I came up with the guitar lick, which became kind of a signature part of the song, but there was never any, well, wait a minute, now that we've added my guitar lick, it should, so no, we didn't do that. Now, I know that for a lot of, I think it was the Eagles, they had this thing that said, write a word, get a third, you know, meaning if you're in
the room, right. Right.
Well, that certainly wouldn't work with us because I think I wrote half the bridges to every song on the album, So no, it was like fun. We were all good and we were all writing hits. Dan wrote Lonely People, Don't Cross the River, It was, we were very, very fortunate in that regard.
Did you ever look at Dewey funny when he sang some of these lyrics to you? Like the first time you heard alligator lizards in the air, did you look at him like, what the hell are you talking about?
I knew him well enough. And I think if you'll allow the parallel, I think that the whole notion of Salvador Dali, with melting clocks and things, some of that is in our brain and we're thinking, anything goes with pop music. But I will tell you that many years later, when a lot of this was all said and done, and Joe Smith and Mo Austin, who were legendary, these two heads of Warner Brothers for a lot of the 70s, I ran into them at a lovely Italian restaurant in LA. They were having lunch together, and they were like these two elderly men, kind of like the guys in the Muppets in the balcony. They're just sitting. And I go up and I reintroduce myself, and I say, Mo, it's Gerry Beckley. And they both look at me and go, Gerry, the heat was hot. It was like the first thing out of their mouths was, in their mind, they summed up the entire
That's amazing.
American experience as the heat was hot. And yeah, it was.
On
quite a while.
On Ventura Highway, not only is there the lyric alligator lizards in the air, but there's also the phrase purple rain. Is that the first time that was ever used in a song?
I swear there is a quote where he says that's where he got it from, but we can't find that. Yeah.
Wow.
I know. And I used to say that on stage when I was kind of doing the rap on stage. I would say, and by the way, Purple Rain, he was ahead of his time.
Wishing on a falling star, waiting for the early train. Sorry, boy, but I've been hit by purple rain. Oh, come on, Joe, you can always change your name. Thanks a lot, son, just the same. Ventura Highway in the sun.
Talk about the gift that keeps giving. Ventura Highway, your lick that you wrote ends up getting sampled by Janet Jackson on a song in the early 2000s called Someone to Call My Lover. I know that there was an issue with Janet Jackson, Let's Wait a While, and your song, Daisy Jane. Did those two have anything to do with each other, or was that just a coincidence?
They had something in common, which was, and now is, my dear friend Jimmy Jam. Jimmy and Terry were producing Janet, and they're big fans, as we are. I've been huge fans of their work for years. So I started getting calls when Let's Wait a While was released as a single. And they said, if you heard this, Janet, it sounds a lot like, and I'm going, I'm sure I would have heard. No, I don't know. And all of a sudden radio stations were playing it back to back. There's something I gotta tell you, just flying me back to Memphis, And so we turned it over. The song was owned, the copyright was owned, Warner Brothers Music owned Daisy. And they approached Jimmy and the other writers and said, we need to work this out. And at the risk of, I don't ever jeopardize an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement, but what I am allowed to say is that I shortly after that installed the Janet Jackson Memorial Swimming Pool at my house. That was part one of that story. Then I'm on a plane one time and Jimmy's up there with his family. And I think, gosh, Jimmy, I got to eventually meet him. I'm going to go up and say hi. And I go up and say hi. And I say, hi, Jimmy, you paid for my swimming pool. And that was the opening line. And I knew that she had cut this track called Someone to Call My Lover. And they had, at the time, the early versions we have of this, they had sampled Our Master and used the guitar lick. And we loved it. What a gift. This is so great. It's probably going to be a big hit. And at the last minute before mastering, as you know, the details of things like this, if they don't use the American Master, they don't have to pay for the use of the master. So he had a guitarist replay the lick. And I said, oh, no, really? And he said, but you'll still do good on the publishing. And I then explained to him, I don't have any publishing on that. The only writer on the...
Right, 100% Dewey, correct.
And I said, by the way, the guy, he does one wrong note in that guitar lick. And I said, I would have come up. He said, well, if I'd had your number, I would have called. So I would have played on that record. But now we're very close. I did a Zoom with him a few weeks ago with somebody else, Dewey and I. And the guy says, we got a call from Jimmy Jam. He'd like to be on the Zoom. So we had Jimmy on the entire hour-long Zoom interview. So it's lovely. So I stay in touch with him.
Yeah, he's the greatest, and Terry's the greatest. And, it's amazing that, like-minded creatives, even if the first time you meet is through NDAs and lawyers, that you guys transcend that and you become bonded by your mutual creativity.
I don't hesitate to point this out, but it's a nice feature because there was also a Michael Jackson track called Place with No Name, which was actually sampled the horse, and it's a new lyrics to Horse with No Name. So there's 3 with the Jackson family that are, and I think it's a testament to that good music is good music. There's no amount of, if you take a nice song by Gerry or Dewey and you put it in the right hands, you can turn it into an R&B classic.
Right.
It's not like, oh, that's wrong. And I think those are good examples of that kind of thing happening very well.
Because they're real copyrights. There's real meat on the bones to the song.
Yeah.
And those songs are going to last forever. Talk about, you mentioned George Martin earlier. After your third album, Hat Trick, underperformed a little bit commercially, you guys hired George Martin to produce the next album, Holiday. And before we talk about George Martin, we talked about Homecoming and Hat Trick and Holiday. What's with the H's?
It started by accident. The first album started to be reprinted saying includes Horse with No Name. So it always called America, but some of the artwork had Horse with No Name on it. We called Homecoming because we had returned to the States. That had nothing to do with picking a letter. The third one we called Hat Trick because in theory, we'd had 2 multi-platinum albums. We were hoping for a third, Hat Trick sports term, which of course didn't go double platinum. But then we realized we had 3. So it was after the 3 that we then thought, maybe we should stick with this H thing. So that's how Holiday was picked.
Ultimately, there would be albums that you released that didn't start with the letter H. There's a record that you made, the first album on Capitol in '79 called Silent Letter. Was that like a nod to that, where the H may have been silent?
Yeah, exactly. Like in Whale, they're silent. The H is there, but it's silent. But we now refer to that album as Silent Record because nobody heard it.
Back to the album that we worked on together with Adam and James. It was called Here and Now, in part as a hat tip to the letter H.
I think we said it's got to have an H. Come on.
So what was the experience like working with George Martin after the first 3 albums were mainly produced by the group?
We were getting deeper and deeper into the whole production element, and it was starting to be honest, to be on my shoulders a little bit more. And I would be kind of in the studio and let me run some roughs on this. You guys go get some dinner or something, what I mean? And we were doing a pretty heavy touring schedule. So because it didn't work well, we thought, what, maybe that piece of the puzzle we should turn over to a producer. We're still going to be writing all the material. We'll still be totally involved in the arrangements and stuff, but we just won't have to stay until the late wee hours of the morning filling out the boxes of who played what, just some of the busy work. And we said, famously, we used to say we made a list and George Martin was at the top of the list. But I don't think there really was a list. I think we just thought, well, we can start with George. He can just say no. Well, there's no reason not to ask him. And so that's what we did. And he said yes.
And that relationship lasted for 6 albums.
Yeah, 7, if you count the greatest hits, which he kind of remixed some of the ones he wasn't involved in. But I love this part of the story. He came to LA. He was in LA because he and Paul were nominated for Live and Let Die. He had been involved in the score of that Bond film, and they were up for an Oscar. So he was there anyway. We had a lovely meeting with him, and he said, the only thing I ask, we were not an unknown. We'd had multi-platinum albums, #1 records. It wasn't like we were asking this guy to take a leap of faith on these unknown guys. And he said, the only thing I ask is that you come to England, because our last album had taken 3 months. And he said, I really can't be gone that long. I have a lovely facility. He had just built Air Studios. He was no longer under the wing of EMI. And we, of course, Dewey and I, half English, we said, of course, we would love to come. So we go to England, and were we really rehearsed, and we did not want to waste a minute of this guy's time. And by the way, sitting right next to him was his engineer, Jeff Emmerich, who is equally as legendary in that position. So he said to us at the start of the project, I've held 2 months. He said, I'm not saying we should be done by then, but let's see how we go. And we did that whole album in 13 days, mixed, overdubbed, everything. And he said to us when we were done, he said, chaps, this has been such a great time, so much fun. It can't possibly be a success. Nothing this easy could be a success. And Tin Man and Lonely People, and we were off and running.
Right, that was the holiday album. You mentioned
Yeah.
you mentioned Tin Man, which was another massive hit. That was also a Dewey song, an outside, quote, quote, outside song.
Oh, Oz never did give nothing to the Tin Man that he didn't already have. And cause never was the reason for the evening or the Tropic of Sir Galahad. So please believe in me when I say I'm spinning round, 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 round. Smoke glass.
Also a song with the English teacher alert again. Oz never did give nothing to the Tin Man that he didn't already have. There you go.
And what's the Tropic of Sir Galahad or something?
What was the Randy Newman quote again?
It's about a guy who thought he took acid.
Lonely People was also a massive hit in late 74, early 75. That was Dan Peek.
This is for all the lonely people, thinking that life has passed them by. Don't give up until you drink from the silver cup and ride that highway in the sky. This is for all the single people, thinking that love has left them dry.
Talk about Dan a little bit, because Dan is a little bit of the unsung member of America now, because he left in 77 and then he passed away over a decade ago. What did Dan bring to the group?
I use the example of a 3-legged stool. You can have an incredibly stable 3-legged stool. The minute you take the third leg off, you've got a weird thing. It took some adjustments, but Dan was a vital part of all of those early years. The contributions of not only his own great writing. Don't Cross the River was a big hit for him, the follow-up to Ventura Highway, a country song. And he had a beautiful high harmony, which is what we needed in the 3-part harmonies.
She feels like leaving and she don't know why. Without no bridges she's trapped, so I sigh. Don't cross the river if you can't swim the tide. Don't try denying living on the other side all your life. You were on your own.
It just turned out that along the journey, Dan had a much harder time navigating all of the twists and turns. And he was really having a challenging time just, making the work and showing up and things. And it got to a point where we couldn't take any bookings because Dan wasn't going to be in any shape. And we did an album in Hawaii where he would be up all night, and Dewey and I would show up at the ungodly hour of 10 in the morning to start work. And Dan would still be up, and we'd have to put him to bed and stuff. So it was just one of those things where it had run its course. And we felt that the only way that Dan was going to have the time and freedom to sort these things out in his life was he's going to have to cut himself loose. So it did work out quite well. Dew and I had to redefine ourselves as a duo. That took a little bit of work. We honed in on the live show and everything. And Dan then went on to be quite successful in the contemporary Christian market. He was nominated for a Grammy. I sang on 2 or 3 of his records, you know. It was just the right call, although it was disappointing to a lot of the fans, you know.
But the great thing is you guys reinvented yourselves, and here we are, 53 years after the birth of the band, and we're still talking. We're still talking about the great music that all 3 of you created together. The next album is Hearts, and that has another number 1 song, 100% written by you, Gerry, called Sister Golden Hair.
Will you meet me in the middle? Will you meet me in the air? Will you love me just a little, just enough to show you care? Will I try to fake it? I don't mind saying I just can't make it.
And I love this trivia note that it's George Martin's first number 1 song as a producer after the Beatles.
Yeah. There are some lovely things about the whole George dynamic. And we were proud and we were excited. I mean, there's no way to say, number 1 record is just as good as it gets. But we were also excited for George because he was such a talented individual and had basically been kind of, he was the 5th Beatle and he did all this stuff, but he was still very active and creative and doing these wonderful things. And he famously said that he made far more money producing America because his deal with EMI was so bad that no matter how much Beatle records were sold, it was like a half of a point or something. So all of a sudden, George was living in the Hollywood Hills with a big Cadillac convertible and stuff. It was just really lovely to be a part of that. And I'd like to think that we were partners in that. We ended up, like we said, doing 7 projects, but Hearts was maybe the pinnacle of that because it was our second number 1 record. It was a strong album for me because the follow-up was Daisy Jane, which was also a hit, not quite a number 1 record, but certainly a hit song. And
Daisy, like we mentioned earlier with the Janet Jackson Let's Wait a While similarity, that's 100% you as well.
Yeah.
After Hearts comes History, America's Greatest Hits, which you mentioned. 7 songs were included from the pre-George Martin era, but he remixed all 7 of those. And the cover art of History, which is drawn from different visuals of your previous albums, the cover art was done by Phil Hartman, the comedian, who I don't think a lot of people realize that he was also a graphic designer, a visual artist.
that was his real profession. The reason we knew Phil was that we were managed after we'd been with Geffen and Roberts for quite a while. And then we left during the Holiday album and we went to another couple named John Hartman and Harlan Goodman. Hartman and Goodman said, "You're not getting the attention you deserve over there. Come to us." Crosby and Nash had just bailed. They were over with Hartman and Goodman. They had signed Poco. It was a lovely kind of newer, fresher office. And John had an incredibly talented brother art director, Phil, who did all the artwork for the projects coming out of, he did the CSN logo and did a lot of fantastic things. And Phil was a character even back then, always a man of a million voices, but was in the Groundlings, I think, in LA, and was doing kind of stand-up and improv. And that was one of the sources that Lauren, looked at whenever he was casting SNL. And so he went from being our art director to, I think if you ask virtually any of the classic, standard stars of SNL, they'll put Phil either at the top or near the top of the talents that came through that machine.
He was so funny, but so talented too. I mean, you talked about the CSN logo, several America albums he designed, also that brilliant Poco album cover and logo that everybody would know if they saw it is Phil Hartman's as well.
Yeah, it's like a Japanese, like a calligraphy, just a very simple.
Gorgeous. Yeah. The band leaves Warner Brothers, moves over to Capitol. George Martin makes your first Capitol record. That relationship ends after 7 albums. you ultimately, on your third Capitol album, you decide to do something that you hadn't done that much, which was go after outside songs that you guys who are known as songwriters did not write, when I say outside songs, it's a different meaning than Dewey writing songs.
You mean it's composed from outside our circle of
Yes,
writers,
there you go. And I recently interviewed Russ Ballard for this podcast, and he wrote You Can Do Magic, which in the summer of 1982 was inescapable, and it was your first hit as a duo of just Gerry and Dewey. What do you remember about that?
Yeah. Well, I remember being on the cover of Cashbox and I think Billboard as Comeback Artist of the Year, which I have to tell you, a lovely feeling after about a 5-year drought. And it was an interesting thing. We had changed management. We were now with a man named Jim Morey, who is to this day still our manager. And we were producing this album with a couple of friends of ours, but we said we are open to doing some outside material. We didn't want to tell Capitol to leave it to us, these aren't selling. And Jim was approached by John Stanley, I think is how it happened. And John Stanley was managing Russ at the time. And we were told that he had written this song for us, which is why it has all the do-do-do-do-do-do-do, kind of the do-do-do, kind of CSN refrains. Although I think he admitted that there had been an earlier version called like You Can Do Voodoo or something, meaning he'd kind of worked on this idea before. And we said, that sounds great. This sounds really great. And part of his deal, which he probably mentioned to you when you spoke to him, was that he wanted to produce any of the songs that he wrote and that he played all the instruments. So I'm never hesitant to give him the credit. The Dewey and I just sang on it. He played everything.
You can do magic. You can have anything that you desire. Magic. And you know you're the one who can put out the fire. You know darn well when you cast your spell, you will get your way. When you hypnotize with your eyes, a heart of stone can turn to clay.
Was it odd to have such a big hit that neither of you wrote?
Because it was within our wheelhouse and it was just one song of 20 or 30 every night on stage, and it sounded like I'm singing it very clearly. It's me, the lead vocal. It sounded like America's song. No, it was fine. I always use as an example, James Taylor. Nobody could ever fault James for, I don't know, James, what happened to your songwriting? Pick it up, dude. Yet he had a massive hit with a Carole King song. He had a massive hit, Up on the Roof, things that he didn't write. But nobody says, James, I wish it was your own tune. You know what I mean? I just think that's a far better dynamic to acknowledge.
Well, if it's a great song, there's no reason you shouldn't sing it, regardless of who wrote it. Speaking of which, the same year that You Can Do Magic was a big hit in 1982, you guys recorded a Jimmy Webb song, a bunch of Jimmy Webb songs for a film called The Last Unicorn. And Jimmy Webb, for me, is probably rock number one on Mount Rushmore of songwriters. He's as good as it gets as a songwriter. So I assume that when you have the opportunity to work with him, you jumped at it.
I sang by the time I get to Phoenix in my high school senior review in 1969. So that's how big a fan I was of Jimmy. When we moved to LA, we were at the same business office. He wasn't with Geffen, but we had the same business management. So through Harry and Jimmy were, attached at the hip. I got to know Jimmy very well. He's the godfather of my first son. It was one of those dynamics where I've often said when I try and speak about the talent of Jimmy Webb. Here's the story I tell. You're in preschool, with all the little kids, and it's playtime in preschool. And they say, okay, now everybody's going to make something out of modeling clay. And you get a little lump of modeling clay, and I'm very busy rolling these little balls, and I'm going to make wheels. And then little Jerry's going to make a car. And I'm very proud of this little car I'm making, and I'm thinking I make a body. And I look over at little Jimmy Webb, and he's built a Bavarian castle.
Just next level.
Yeah. And it's got towers and flags flying and stuff. I said, that's what it's like to be a friend of Jimmy Webb. It's such a great gift and everything, but it is so annoying because he's off the charts. We did a tribute thing to George Martin when George was still alive, and it was a thing in USC. That's all outdoors, and we were all sharing tables. And I was sharing a table. Dewey and I were sitting there with Jimmy Webb and Burt Bacharach. And the two of them were sitting there leaning, kind of whispering to each other in their ears. And I'm thinking, oh my God, I wish I could hear what they're saying. Because in my world, if you take John and Paul, I don't want to say take them out of the equation, but let's just set them aside and let's put Brian Wilson, just push him to the other side. To me, the top of the peak is Jimmy and Burt.
Oh my God. Yeah. So good. Crazy, 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 crazy.
That song, in fact, the title song for The Last Unicorn, wonderful animated film, that was a #1 record in Germany. So all of a sudden it was in our show as the encore.
Then look into the sky where through the clouds a path is torn. Look and see her, how she sparkles. It's the last unicorn. I'm alive. I'm alive.
Yeah, I was just listening to it. It's a great song. Anytime that you can listen to a Jimmy Webb song, it's like, what's wrong with that? So overall, America's made 18 studio albums, if I've calculated correctly. You've made 10 solo Gerry Beckley studio albums. Most recent this past June, self-titled, after 9 other albums that had titles. And America released Live from the Hollywood Bowl, the 1975 album that was recorded in 1975, not Matty Healy 1975, that you released this past September, and it charted on a couple of charts that you guys have never been on, like Classical Crossover and Classical on Billboard.
We're back, baby.
There you go. So, now that you're not touring anymore, what does the future look like for Gerry Beckley?
I'm 72 now, Pete, and I've openly said to family and friends, I don't want to be presumptuous, but I'd like to have a decade where I can enjoy my friends and family, travel, do projects that I choose, and just not have to be on a regional jet every morning at 7 a.m. to connect through O'Hare to play some venue. They have been doing a fantastic job this year. Dew's going to go out next year. I'm so proud of them. You don't need me to say, just read the reviews. I mean, there's plenty of the, gee, I sure miss Jer. It's not like I'm going, wait a minute. But I couldn't be happier for them because they are doing, we saw McCartney recently, 82 years old, across the street here in Sydney. He did 2 stadium shows back-to-back, 3 hours each. He's 80 some years old. Why is Paul doing that? It's because he wants to do it.
Right.
I'm directing a documentary, which is about the arc of popular music in the 20th century, something I know a little bit about. And I'm looking forward to doing that. I'm constantly doing solo projects and producing other artists, singer-songwriters. I was working with Jack Tempchin recently. There's a name you probably remember from all of his Eagles days.
Peaceful, easy feeling. Sure.
Yeah, there's no shortage of stuff. And I have a lovely family and 2 beautiful homes. I'm in my studio in Sydney at the moment. I was just sending off a track to David Foster, who is producing stuff for his wife for a solo project. And I thought, yeah, that'd be nice.
Well, she's a great singer. Yeah. Catherine McPhee. There you go. So maybe on the next Catherine McPhee album, we will see a song recorded by Catherine, produced by David, and written by Gerry Beckley. Fingers crossed.
There you go. Wouldn't that be great?
Great speaking with you, Gerry. Big fan. Loved working with you, and appreciate the time.
Oh, man. Nice to see you. Nice to talk with you. My love to everybody who's listening. All right.
Absolutely. Take care. Thank you.
All right. Bye, mate. Bye-bye.
Mary, have you seen better days? 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 Have you seen better days? Have you seen better days?
Special thanks to America's Gerry Beckley for joining us this week. For more info on Gerry, visit his website, gerrybeckley.com. That's Gerry with a G. And for more info on America, including upcoming tour dates, visit their website, venturahighway.com. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time for another episode of Rock and Roll High School.
Rock and Roll High School is a presentation of Pure Tone Music. Produced by Pete Ganbarg, with assistance from Craig Rosen, Ron Robinson, Stefan Accardo, Joe Palmerico, Zach Kornhauser, Ross Owen, Elena Luvis, Claire Hudson, Steve Leeds, and Rich Mahan. Please visit our website at rockschoolpodcast.com for past episodes and information on what's coming next. All rights reserved.